that wasn't an option because what would happen is you'd get together with your community group and you'd share something personal. And next thing you know, Sally and Josie had gone home and told their mothers, and their mothers basically said, well, don't hang out with Amy. I mean, this is true. This happened not just to me. This was common. And then, those parents would then tell my parents. I mean, there was nothing sacred. There was nothing private. And it was all under the guise of like, well, we better be praying for Amy. But really, it was just a gossip factory. Anybody else have that experience?
Welcome to Amy Liz Harrison's podcast, Eternally Amy, a mum of eight's journey from jail to joy. A Gen Xer who overcame her struggle with alcohol to become a best-selling author and mental health advocate. She shares stories of hope and offers ideas for others struggling with mental health challenges, spirituality, ADHD, or maybe just family, travel, and logistics. One thing is for sure, you'll leave with something to chew on. And now, here's your host, Amy Liz Harrison, with your mystery meat sandwich.
Greetings, compadres. For your mystery meat sandwich today, sanity is defined as soundness of mind. Yet no alcoholic, soberly analyzing his destructive behavior, whether the destruction fell on the dining room furniture or his own moral fiber, can claim soundness of mind for himself. Therefore, step 2 is the rallying point for all of us. Whether agnostic, atheist, or former believer, we can stand together on the step. Page 33 of the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. So, gang, sidebar, before we jump into the chaplain's chat, I just want to say that it's super loud here today. I'm in a different room. I've got some kind of a vent blowing that I can't turn off. There's a high probability that at some point behind me in the room directly adjacent to this one, we will hear some mopping of some kind. There's just a lot going on. I've got my kids home today. They have a lot of January and February. Well, basically a lot of Mondays off right now. Not super sure. It's kind of new this year. We didn't have this last year. So just wanted to throw that out there that you may hear several different interesting noises. Hashtag sorry, Kyle. I know you do such a good job cleaning up after I have left you with a big mess, a big audio mess. So, for your chaplain's chat, being that there are 12 months in a year, I started something new in January. And because there's a step for every month in 12-step programs, what I thought I'd do is touch on each step, one per month, just kind of whatever comes to mind. I'm not going to totally unpack them as if I were sponsoring my listeners. I'm just going to kind of high level talk about them because the thing is, we all have things that we can work on. So this series I've titled 12 Steps for anyone who wants them. And last time in January, we talked about powerlessness. And we talked about how powerlessness is actually empowering and what that looks like and how that can possibly be, how that paradox can be. And so this month, being February, the second month of the year, it shouldn't be super surprising to hear that we're talking about step 2. Okay, and step 2, if you're unfamiliar with 12-step programs, came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. So a lot of times when you're looking at the steps, there are just kind of many different life examples, metaphors, parallels you can draw from them. And actually, what the steps end up being is really a starting place, a foundation. There are so many directions that you can go with each step that it's like this untapped, resource that we all can continually contribute to as time goes on and as we grow and we learn more. So, my background in the church and how my perception of the religion that I grew up with and am still loosely connected to today at different levels um, was very much set on assurance and the concept of surety, right? So, in the past over decade that I've been sober, it's been such an interesting concept because I've had to unlearn all of these lifelong assumptions and ways at looking at everything basically in my life as if I were the judge and jury of all things, and that the plumb line was basically the Bible. And so, for me personally, to open up the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is the book that I most reference because that is the one that I used when I got sober. So it's the one I'm most familiar with. But to come to steps 2 and 3, which are about God and about believing that there is a God, a power greater than myself who can restore me to sanity. And also, this same God in step 3, I can turn my will and my life over to his care or its care, any higher power's care. I just thought, you know what? Pass. Let's fast forward. Let's get on to the 4th step because I was raised in the church, so I totally have this in the bag. I don't need any refresher course. Thank you very much. Move on was kind of the way I looked at it. So when I got to the chapter that's called We Agnostics, which is basically all about step 2. And we're not even going to really touch on we agnostics in this podcast. And that's a whole huge thing in and of itself. It's a beautiful chapter of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. But what we're going to do today is just talk about being restored to sanity, right? And so, in order to be restored to sanity, I have to really understand what sanity is and how insanity manifests itself in my life or manifested itself along the way. So, when I got to the point of looking at we agnostics and I realized, oh, wait a minute. Okay. So, this basically is meaning here that I doubt. I don't know everything, and perhaps I doubt. Perhaps I don't know if there is a higher power. Who knows? And growing up in the church, for me, was very emotionally confusing. And however you were taught to process emotion as a child, as a young adult, if you had something that seemed a little strange, knowing that all of our parents did the very best they could with the tools that they had at the time, right? That's kind of a given. We've talked about that a lot. But say we all had, we all had some way of processing emotion that we were taught, whether by, maybe our parents were hippies, maybe our parents were super stoic, maybe we were in a tight religious group, like I was, where there were certain expectations of how you were going to handle your emotions. We can come together and really unpack what that emotional processing or more frankly put, lack of emotional processing did to us, and the threads that are remaining from all of that. And so, of course, I'm going to share like my experience with this, but please substitute it for your own. And so I'm going to start off, of course, by mentioning what it was like in the church where I grew up and what happened, how it affected me, and what I've learned so far for today. So, the first section I'm going to talk about, you guys, is the lack of emotional processing. So, listen, okay. In the movie Footloose, you know I love to draw a parallel or a metaphor with an 80s movie wherever I can. So, of course, I'm talking about the 1980s version of Footloose because, as far as I'm concerned, there isn't another one, okay? Hashtag denial. Anyway, okay, at the beginning, John Lithgow is giving a sermon in a church. He's a pastor in the small town of Beaumont. And in part of his sermon, he's got his hands raised and he's kind of standing, affixed sort of near the pulpit. And he's saying, God is testing us. And he's got this booming fire and brimstone type voice. And so while my particular church was less fire and brimstone than that, I completely relate to that. We were taught growing up in our church that, this is, the interpretation of God is that he's testing us. He's got a clipboard. And basically every single day he would sit there and he would tick off. So here's God, this picture, the visual here of God, ticking off how we handled every situation. So how I personally handled every situation and every day. And then, those of us in the church, so like PS, no pressure. No pressure at all because God is testing us. And worse than that, and I talk about this in my book, worse than that is thinking, and somewhere I know the other former recovering evangelicals can attest to this as well. There was a popular theme floating around in those days where youth leaders and youth pastors would tell kids that there was a videotape that was going to be played upon our death. And the videotape was going to be God showing us our entire lives, like some big VHS tape, right? And he was going to then analyze with us. I mean, I picture this as like in today's day and age, like when my son and his football team watch film after the game, like same thing is basically what was explained to us. And so here's God going over our entire life, everything that we did, said, thought, and he was going to essentially school us and then decide whether or not we should be allowed into his kingdom for eternity based on that videotape, which I'm saying it right now and I'm hearing myself talk about it and I'm appalled. I am so, so shocked and appalled because it's really sad. That's not in the Bible. So I don't know. I think it was a scare tactic, but it was something that led me to believe that God was Santa Claus. I've talked about this too, that you could be naughty, you could be nice. God was watching, God knew, and he was judging you and keeping track. Okay. He had a big old scorecard. So, what you're left with then, if you're me or any other evangelical, from the 80s and 90s, and some of us have, are no longer in that space. So I apologize for my frankness to those who are still deeply rooted in the church and the way it was taught to us. I apologize because I'm very detached from it now in the very toxic and unhealthy senses that I picked up. And I'm speaking for myself and my own experiences. So at the end of this, you've got God with this clipboard. You've got John Lithgow pounding on the pulpit and raising his arm and saying, God's testing us. You know, how do I, as a kid, begin to process my feelings? And then later in life, when you get to sort of high school age, and the youth group leaders are telling you that, God knows your thoughts. He knows your thoughts. I mean, of course, now looking back, hindsight is 2020. I'm like, oh gosh, okay. They were trying to keep us out of lustful thoughts. They were trying to help us cultivate a purity of mind. So let's go ahead and tell them that God knows their thoughts and is watching them. So you can see how screwed up that is. And having had a lifetime of that, by the time you're even a teenager, I mean, that's what you know. And so the process of unlearning some of these things is just difficult later in life, difficult and shocking, and also very sad when I realized how much guilt and shame was associated with my own normal human thoughts and age appropriate developmental thoughts. Does that make sense? So, how were we taught to process emotional discourse? I mean, for me, the answer to that question is pray and read the Bible. That's what we were taught. And so, for a lot of us, that really wasn't going to be very helpful. And I think for those leading us in those days, it was kind of like shrugging off like a big old wool scratchy sweater. So we would present, these kinds of questions. Well, what are we supposed to do about these feelings or whatever? And it was like, okay, pray more, pray more. Like, don't talk to me about feelings. I'm not here to do that. I'm here to tell you to read the Bible. Go get with your community group and, pray. And really, that wasn't an option, because what would happen is you'd get together with your community group and you'd share something personal. And next thing Sally and Josie had gone home and told their mothers, and their mothers basically said, well, don't hang out with Amy. I mean, this is true. This happened not just to me. This was common. And then, those parents would then tell my parents. I mean, there was nothing sacred. There was nothing private. And it was all under the guise of like, well, we better be praying for Amy. But really, it was just a gossip factory. Anybody else have that experience? Okay. So sidebar, I want to just say something quickly about prayer. Of course, today, meditation is a huge part of my mental health wellness practice. It's a huge part of it. But in terms of praying, I mean, gosh, there were books growing up. There were so many different philosophies about how to pray, how God would hear you best, blah, blah, blah. And really, today, I don't do very much praying in the conventional sense that I was raised in, because it's a lot of, or at least growing up, it was a lot of me telling God what I thought God's will was instead of just letting it naturally happen. I found for me that today it works better if I just get out of my own way and free fall into the existence and the mystery of life. So that was a sidebar. And so essentially what you're left with is, if you're supposed to handle your emotions by praying and reading the Bible, um, that's fantastic if that worked for you. It did not work for me. And what ended up happening to me and to many others is we repressed those emotions, because we were told that, strength is not showing emotion. Many of you women can relate to this if you've ever been in the workplace before and started crying over something. It's like we're told not to cry, right? That shows weakness. And so, in the workplace or not, We learn to, zip up these suits of armor, essentially, and ignore our feelings. And we're taught that that's a good thing, or at least I was. And what happens? Of course, it's like the beach ball underwater, right? It comes flying out. At some point, it will come fly out of, the um, tight legged, tight armed captivity that you've had over this beach ball. It just kind of poosh flies out at some point. And so that's what I want to talk about next is that, for me, that came out in the form of escapism. And it was, of course, later in life. It was when I, had that miscarriage. And I talk all about this in my book as well. But, you get to this point where I'm questioning everything I thought I knew at age 25 or so. And I couldn't make any sense of it. And it was just terrifying. And so I wanted to escape those terrifying feelings, but it was so daunting to me. It was like the rug had been totally pulled out from underneath me. And so I escaped it by drinking, right? By trying to cover up my big feelings. Now I process the hell out of things because, I just don't need that drama in my life. I just don't. And so, I choose safe people who are generally like my inner tight circle from, my 12-step community. And, it just helps me to make sense of what I'm feeling, validate what I'm feeling, work through it, talk to somebody else who's been through it, journal about it, boom, walk through it. So next time is going to be all about that, about healthy ways to actually make progress through emotional turmoil. But it's going to come out somewhere. So whether by overeating, over shopping, whatever, it's going to come out. And it's better to process it, right? It's much safer, I think. So the second thing I want to talk about is emotional repression and a lack of self-love. What? So I got to be careful when I talk about this because self-love is not something that was encouraged in our church. Okay. But I would surmise, and this is just me speculating and pontificating, that it's not a surprise all over the streets of Seattle that we have a mental health crisis, that we have an addiction crisis. And, just as it talks about in the 12 and 12, the quote that I read at the beginning in the mystery meat sandwich, it's referring to somebody who gets drunk and smashes up the living room furniture. And so drinking is simply an escape from dealing with these big emotions, right? And many times we cause destruction physically, mentally, emotionally. And it's because many or most of us, we just weren't taught that it was acceptable to have feelings. And it's part of a human experience, right? But, you know, we were told to, that children are to be seen and not heard. I mean, all that stuff. And every generation has been sort of told a similar lie over time. And as a parent, whether that's to gain control of a child or of a situation, whatever it is not super healthy. We were told that if we went to therapy, it was a sign of weakness and that there was something wrong with us. At least in the church, that's what we were told. Now, we've made progress as a society, and the church has also made a little progress in this area, which is great. But I also know that there are still many religions out there, many denominations where it is not okay to go to therapy or that it's something to be ashamed of. Whereas in my experience, going to therapy it's like getting educated. So learning what your triggers are, learning how to deal with them and what to do about them, and learning how to navigate them, that's priceless. And I started doing it in rehab. We each had counselors in rehab, and we sorted through some of the junk drawers of our past. And that was the first time it had ever been mentioned to me that I didn't have any self love. And I was like, huh. So what you're saying here is, hmm, I think I do have self-love. And really there's self-love, and then there's selfish behavior, selfishness, self-centeredness. That is the root of our trouble. Like, there are a lot of things in the 12-step community that would say, "Oh, no, you loved yourself enough to, play into your addiction and not make your kids and family a priority and blah, blah, blah." True, all true. And this is another, point that's another subject. So it's sort of like yes and, right? Both things can simultaneously be true. But I'm talking about the concept of self love. Okay. So, one of the things that my therapist had me do was look in the mirror, and it's super awkward. And you have to look at yourself in the eyes, and you have to say, "I love you." And you have to say it 3 times, and you have to mean it. And you're also supposed to get naked. And this part is like really difficult if you've had children. And if you have any kind of body image issues, you get naked, you look in the mirror, and you say, "Thank you, body. I love you, body." So these are some exercises. I keep getting off track. I'm sorry. But these are some exercises that really help to develop it. Does it leave you this totally um, crazy, woke, body image, self-lovingly filled person? No, but it's a practice, right? It's a step towards that direction every time you do it. That's what I found. So, as I move into my final point for today, which is going to be the restoration to sanity, I want you to keep in mind that a lack of self love was basically something that was encouraged at the church. So, this whole concept in the church of die to self, I mean, that was pretty much one of the pillars. Jesus is the answer to everything. You don't need anything else other than Jesus. And if you're not okay with that, then there's something wrong with your relationship with God. And I just want to say, as I wrap up this section, that I call BS on that, because I believe that God puts people in our lives basically to help teach us how to be humans. And I think what was confusing to me back then was, yes, Jesus was on the earth and he was there. There's this concept called the Trinity, right? Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, Jesus being the Son. And it's supposed to be, I mean, I'm not going to get started talking about the Trinity because we'll be here forever, but the Trinity is sort of three in one, God in three forms, but the whole three forms in one is God. So it's kind of supposed, the metaphor they always give is like steam and water and ice. All three are forms of water. Okay. So if Jesus was put on the earth to show us how to have, that God could relate to us by having a human experience. And by the way, God later allowed Jesus to be killed, his only son to be killed. So there's that. We're not going there today. Jesus was put on the earth to have a human experience so we could see what that was like, but he was perfect. So I personally can't relate to that at all. I can't relate to a God who gives me an example of how to be human, but the example is perfection. I'm not down. I'm just not. So today, I can't personally relate to that. And to me, you know how that sounds? It sounds insane. So opening up the last part of this restoration to sanity, came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. I don't know, gang. It seems like this whole idea of repressing emotion and that walking through our emotions is really cultivating self love. That is something that I could sign off on. Repressing emotion, not healthy. Perfection, toxic, right? But walking through emotions in a healthy way is practicing self love. Totally could get on board with that, have gotten on board with it, right? It seems to me that denying emotions and denying the sheer existence of them, it's not humble, it's not holy, it's not emotionally mature or intelligent. Doesn't mean you have an amazing relationship with God and you're going to win the holiness competition. Frankly, today, the way I see the world and in the lens through which I see it, it just, it sounds preposterous to me that I ever truly believed in all of that stuff about repressing my emotions. And if I look back over the emotional architecture of my life, it's no wonder I started drinking. Like, and it's not like I came from any kind of a terrible background, right? It's just that these messages that are so deeply implanted in us as children, they stick with us, right? And in therapy, we learn what our triggers are, right? What our false beliefs are. What are our like limiting beliefs about ourselves? And so cultivating self love by going to therapy, cultivating self love by joining 12-step programs, by reading books, by opening our minds to new concepts, to not turn off certain ideas because they don't fit in with our denomination's viewpoint of what's godly and what's not, right? I mean, to me, it seems like the more the better. Like, bring it on. Self awareness, self love, bring it on. Because I want to be whole, right? Like, I'm not interested in showing up to life as a fractured individual because I'm going to spread that toxicity everywhere. So it's like, hey, bitches, restore me to sanity. Like, I'm down. That's what I want. It's like, it's kind of like I'm a spiritual junkie now. Like, that is what I seek, is just more. My ism has now translated to more. And by ism, what I mean is there's a bunch of different ways to define the ISM, but I call it I seek more. So I seek more of it. I mean, and I'll kind of wrap it up by sharing just a couple things. It seems insane to me that if I were having a physical pain that I would just ignore it or pray about it or read the Bible and not deal with it. Today that just sounds completely ridiculous. And emotions aren't necessarily sane, but at that moment, they're my truth, right? They feel real because emotions, I talk about this a lot, are emotion. They're in motion. And so they're a force. They are a life force and a flow inside of us. And, if I had acute pain and suffering, am I just, going to tell myself it's not happening and that's going to benefit me in some way? Yeah, I don't think so because I've been in that place many times. The other day somebody said something to me that I perceived to be hurtful, and I had to process through that with another person. A safe person, again, is generally a 12-stepper, somebody who I know is kind of a vault and certainly not I would definitely not go to Christians, but I'm not willing to risk screwing up my life or drinking over some stupid resentment of some way that I heard someone say something, right? Because I see and I hear things through the lens of my triggers, of my weak points. And by weak, I actually don't mean weak, but points of pain, right? So I need to go over with safe people. Hey, this is what I heard. This is how I feel, right? What do you see here? What do you think can help me to see this in a new light? I need to see this anew. I need to see it afresh. I need to reframe it. But I also need to journal about it and then burn it. I also need to type a draft email and never send it. Whatever it is. That's why they have you do role playing and all of that in rehab. You're using another person as basically a surrogate, a substitute for, whoever it is that you need to talk to from your past, who's maybe dead, who's maybe unsafe to have a conversation with at this stage in real life, right? We need each other. We need to process to restore ourselves to sanity. And so, for your bailout bag, this is a huge topic, gang. I mean, it's huge. I have barely scraped the surface, right? Barely. So, by no means is this a deep dive. But part of the process of restoring ourselves to sanity and seeking out that self-love, and part of that believing that we're worthy of it, is admitting that, what, I don't have all the answers inside of me. Like, I can't live with that safety net of assurance of like, well, the Bible says it, I believe it, and that's the end of it. And I'm pretty sure, P.S., that was a 1980s bumper sticker. I'm pretty sure that they had it down at Evangel Bookstore in Mountain View. May have bought it, not too sure. Bought it? Did I say bought it? Oh my goodness. Purchased it. Sorry, gang. Clearly have gone too long. So my point is this, okay? We do need outside sources to pour into our lives, whether it's a person, whether it's a new thought. Okay, we need a power. And that is what we're going to talk about next time. We're going to talk about finding this power and getting plugged in. Because if we are restored to sanity, we're going to need help in deconstructing some of that negative stuff, some of those deep-rooted falsities that we've been carrying around. All right? I'm sorry if this was a lot, but hopefully it gave you something to think about. Again, I want to say, Christians, I love you. I am not trying to come down on you. I'm in what Father Richard Rohr calls the second half of life, right? I needed that structure the first half of my life, and now for the second half of my life, what I really need is I need health, I need wellness, I need peace of mind and peace of spirit. And all of those things I have found when I stopped taking the Bible so literally, when I stopped shaming myself, and when I started to love myself. As always, be kind, rewind. Thank you for the honor of your time, and take what you like and leave the rest behind.
Thank you so much for listening to Eternally Amy. Amy Liz Harrison is a best-selling author, speaker, 12-step coach, meditation teacher, and recovery advocate. To find out more, please visit amylizharrison.com. Keep up with Amy on all platforms by following @AmyLizHarrison. Please subscribe and review this podcast. It means so much to us if you do.